I took my wife and kids to my parents' ranch out in the sticks. They have a huge property out there that my kids love to play on, and a great house that my wife wants us to move into. The only problem with this one trip was that my wife invited her parents to stay with us for the weekend. I love my wife, but I loathe her mother. It only took her a few hours to piss me off so badly I couldn't even be around anyone. I wasn't able to sleep that night either. I just kept cussing my mother-in-law out in my head. Around 4 in the morning, I decided to go for an impromptu hunt. I didn't even care about catching or shooting anything. I just wanted to avoid my in-laws for the day. I always take my gear with me to my parents' place in case I get the itch to go hunting or camping. So I loaded up, left a note from my wife, borrowed my dad's old bolt-action rifle, and headed into the woods before dawn. I made my way to one of the blinds I used to hunt from when I was younger, where I climbed up and got situated, then quickly started to feel sleepy, so I figured I'd take a nap until daybreak. However, I was awoken soon after by the strangest noise I'd ever heard. I couldn't tell if an animal was dry heaving or if someone out there was laughing. It was just these awful, guttural shouts. I stood up quietly and looked outside. Dawn was approaching, so there was a tiny glow of light, barely enough to make out anything. I spotted something through my scope a ways away, but I only got a glimpse of it before it darted behind a tree. I couldn't believe it, but it looked like a person, so I sat there and stared at that tree, waiting for something to appear. I didn't want to shout in case it was actually something I wouldn't want to scare away. Eventually, it was full daylight out and nothing had happened. I gave up, figuring I had just imagined it was more than it was in my groggy state, probably just a sick animal that climbed up a tree. By then, I was getting hungry, so I set up my little camp stove inside the blind. I know it's not the safest thing and the smell of food can drive away deer, but I really didn't care about anything but being alone. I had brought with me some trail mix, some chili that my dad made, and of course some instant coffee. I got the water heating up for the coffee first while I snacked on the trail mix. The sound of the stove burning was quiet, so I could still hear what was going on outside. The water wasn't even warm before I started to hear something. It was movement, nearby and fairly large. I grabbed the rifle and looked outside, but I couldn't see anything in that direction. I thought maybe I'd moved too loud or the smell of gas drove it away. However, just a few seconds later, I heard the same noise again, even closer this time, but out the other direction. I looked over and again saw nothing. Frustrated, I lowered the rifle and stepped away from the wall, only to hear something from outside the door. I looked through, and this time, there was something out there indeed, but it wasn't what I had hoped for. 30 feet away, the face of an old man was peeking out from behind a tree. He was smiling with no teeth in his mouth, just red, swollen gums. His skin was gray and greasy, and he had no hair on the top of his head but a thin gray wisp. The sight of him shook me, causing me to trip backwards, spilling hot water and trail mix all over the floor of the blind. I rushed to turn the stove off before it burned the whole thing down, and in just those few seconds, the man outside had closed the distance between us. I was still on the ground when he opened the door. Standing over me, he looked even more harrowing. He looked like a skeleton, with nothing on except a filthy pair of tattered briefs. I scrambled and reached for the rifle, expecting him to come at me, but then he immediately hit the deck and started eating all the spilled trail mix. Trapped in there with him, I just crawled back into the corner with my rifle in my hands and watched him lap up every single piece and swallow it whole like a dog. I couldn't fathom what I was looking at. A human? An animal? Something else? Would it turn to eat me when it was finished? Sure enough, when all the food on the floor was gone, the man looked at me and started crawling. He was staring into my soul with his mouth open, making those same horrible grunting, heaving sounds I heard earlier. Panicking, I grabbed the container of chili sitting next to me and opened it, then quickly slid it over. The man picked it up, smelled it, then stuck his tongue out and licked across the entire surface like he was marking it. In less than a minute, the man drank the entire container and licked it clean. It was the most disgusting thing I've ever seen. When I realized he was about to demand more food and I didn't have any, I took the last opportunity while he was distracted and bolted out of the blind. I took only the rifle, letting him dig through the rest, and I ran all the way back to the ranch. I'd rather deal with my mother-in-law than find out the extent of danger I was in with that nasty freak in the woods. I told my family about it and reported it to the sheriff, but everyone seemed to kind of just laugh it off. The deputies did search the area around my parents' house, but they never found any trace of the man. To this day, I still have nightmares about him. What if I hadn't brought food? Would I have been on the menu? Does that man just live in the woods around my parents? All I know is I'm never moving back there to find out. Life is truly filled with horror stories. These traumatic events leave many people with severe and life-altering injuries, but even after the trauma, the struggle isn't over. Have you ever thought about what you would do after you got injured? If you had medical bills to pay but no ability to work? How would you know that your insurance companies or the people responsible for your injuries are being fair to you? Then, trying to navigate the situation with traditional law firms can be a daunting, confusing ordeal that brings even more pain. The piles of paperwork, the hours of your valuable time used up, and the expensive fees hitting you while you're already down. With Morgan & Morgan, America's largest injury law firm, that won't be a problem. When you're seriously hurt, your injury could be worth millions. Morgan & Morgan don't accept lowball settlements from insurance companies. In recent months, they've achieved massive victories for victims of serious car crashes. In Florida, they achieved a verdict for $12 million, which was 34 times greater than the highest insurance offer. In Philadelphia, they achieved a verdict for a $26 million payout, 40 times more than the highest settlement offered by the insurance company. Morgan & Morgan will fight for you to get the best outcome if you become their client. If you hire Morgan & Morgan, you won't just be assigned a single lawyer, but an entire dedicated legal team with lawyers, case investigators, paralegals, and customer care specialists, all working to maximize your settlement. On top of that, there are thousands of support staff available at all hours to help you with any questions or concerns about your case, making the experience as painless as possible. The best part is, you don't pay them a penny unless you win your case. And Morgan & Morgan didn't become the largest injury law firm for no reason. It's because they win a lot. Even better, they've modernized the injury law process, so it only takes minutes to see if you have a case, and you can submit your claim on your phone. If you ever get seriously injured, your case could be worth millions, and you're only a few clicks away from potentially changing your life. It's easy. You can start your claim with Morgan & Morgan at www.forthepeople.com/MJV, found in the description below, or by scanning the QR code on screen with your phone's camera. You can type in your name, phone number, zip code, and email address, select the type of your claim, then describe what happened. Click or tap Start Your Claim and you're done. Remember, Morgan & Morgan is the largest injury law firm in the United States, so they have all the resources and know-how to see your case through. There's no company too big for Morgan & Morgan to fight, and they'll fight for you to get the settlement you deserve if you become their client. It was late October, and I'd finally cleared my schedule enough to schedule a weekend getaway. Hunting had always been a way for me to clear my head and just get away from all the stresses of life. I'd rented a cabin deep in the woods that seemed perfect from the pictures online. The road leading to the cabin was a narrow dirt road. I pulled up to my cabin just as the sun was rising. The air was fresh and the woods were dead silent, broken only by the crunch of my boots as I unloaded my bags from the car. A little too silent. I couldn't hear the birds chirping or squirrels running up and down the trees. Not even the leaves were rustling. It felt like the woods had been frozen in time. I shrugged it off and let myself into the cabin. It was modest, one room with a small kitchen, a creaky twin bed, and a fireplace. The place was dingy and dirtier than the pictures had shown, but it would do just fine. I unpacked, loaded my rifle, and headed out into the woods. I wandered north, searching for signs of deer. Hours passed, but I found absolutely nothing. I'd been hunting in this area before, and it had been full of all kinds of wildlife. Now, there didn't even seem to be any bugs chirping around. Gave me the creeps, but I pressed on, not wanting my trip to go to waste. Finally, when the sun was setting and just as I was about to turn back, I heard noises ahead. I scurried forward, hoping to catch the animal before it got away. That's when I saw them. Through the trees, maybe 50 yards away, was a group of people gathered around a fire. There were 6 or 7 of them, all wearing dark robes with hoods that obscured their faces. They stood in a circle, chanting in low, guttural voices that didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. I froze. The people hadn't noticed me. They swayed in unison, muttering on and on. My heart pounded in my chest. I clutched my gun tight. I knew these people were bad news, so I slowly began to creep backwards. I went very slowly, careful not to step on a twig or rustle a leaf. When I was far enough, I turned and sprinted straight for my cabin. My mind raced the whole way there. Who were those people? What were they doing out here? I got back to my cabin and ran for the door. I pulled out the key and grabbed the doorknob, but to my horror, the door pushed open. It had been left ajar, but I knew for sure that I had shut and locked it before I left. My stomach twisted as I stepped inside the dark cabin. I turned on the light and saw my bag had been overturned, the contents dumped along the floor. My sleeping bag had been ripped off the bed and torn down the middle. Someone had broken into my cabin. I scoured the inside with my gun, making sure no one was inside. Once I confirmed it was empty, I shut and locked all the doors and windows again. I gathered up my stuff, ready to get in my car and get the hell out. And then it started storming. Not just a light rain, it felt like buckets of water were being dumped on the roof of the cabin. Thunder struck constantly. I thought back to the sketchy dirt road I'd driven in on and realized I didn't want to take my chances on it, even if that meant staying in these woods. I heated up some food in the fireplace but didn't feel very hungry. Every noise I heard outside made me jump, thinking of those weird, robed people and who could have broken into my cabin. Exhaustion started to catch up with me. I crawled into bed, still clutching my gun. My nerves wouldn't let me fully relax, but eventually, I fell asleep. I woke up to the sounds of voices. At first, I thought I was dreaming. The low chanting was faint, almost drowned out by the pounding rain in my ears. But as I sat up, it grew louder. I clutched my rifle and crept to the window. They were outside. The same group I'd seen in the woods was now standing in a loose circle around the cabin. Even through the rain and walls of my cabin, I could hear their guttural chants. Goosebumps rippled on my arms, and my heart hammered in my chest. I slammed open the window and shouted into the rain, "Get the hell out of here!" They didn't flinch. They just kept chanting, "Get out of here or I'll shoot!" I slammed the window, brandishing my weapon through the glass. I grabbed my phone and called the cops. They told me they'd send a car out as soon as possible. I spent an agonizing 20 minutes keeping an eye on the robed figures through the rain. About 5 minutes before the cops came, the figures disappeared into the woods. The cops came. They scanned the surrounding area but found no trace of the cult. They followed me back into town and assured me that it was probably just kids playing a prank on me. I want to believe him, but deep down, I know something more sinister was going down that night. I used to live in a remote rural area, so my dad took me hunting for the first time when I was still a kid. After going quite a few miles from the house on ATVs, the trail split and it became too small. My dad told me to hike a mile down one path to find a blind marked with a red ribbon, while he went down the other way. He said it was better to have one man per blind, as we'd be quieter and have a better chance at seeing a deer. I was fairly confident being in the wilderness, but I'd never been that deep. The trees there were older and larger than I was used to, and there were less shrubs because the canopy shaded the whole area. The sounds out there were more intense than I'd ever heard. There didn't seem to be a single moment without the wailing of some bird. For the first time ever, I truly felt that the forest was alive, and I was the hunter coming to kill the prize beast at the heart of it. The creatures I encountered felt like spies, peeking at me before scurrying away to report my location. Who they answered to, I didn't know, but armed with my rifle, I was sure I could take them out if they caused me problems. By the time I spotted the red ribbon on the blind, the sun had been up for well over an hour. I took the ribbon down off the blind, unsure if the deer would notice it. Then I crawled inside to get warm. The day was just beginning. I would leave at 4 o'clock and regroup with my dad before the sun went down, but that was hours away. It was then that I realized what this kind of hunting entailed. I had to be as quiet and still as possible, constantly on the lookout for game. In the beginning, I was still enthusiastic. I kept a sharp eye on every angle into the woods, watching and listening for any sign of deer or perhaps something more dangerous like a coyote or even a bear. I figured I'd take a coyote for my first kill and spare my chickens one more predator. As the hours dragged on, however, my perspective changed. I was bored and restless and sick of the cold. The only things I'd seen were birds or squirrels. I started to doubt that this section of the forest was any more active than my own backyard. In the final hour, I told myself that even if I didn't get a deer, I'd kill the next thing I saw. The sun was getting lower, making this dark and cold forest even more miserable, even more deserving of losing a resident. That's when I finally saw something. I heard it first. It was lumbering behind the trees, huffing with some kind of attitude. I knew it was going to be big, but I was blown away when I saw a massive stag emerge in my sights not even 50 feet away. I tried to line up the shot, but in my excitement with freezing hands, I was shaking too much. I decided I needed to wait until it got closer since it was heading towards me. Then, to my amazement, I heard more motion next to me. I looked over and saw another deer, this time a doe. They were headed towards each other, like they were going to meet. I watched them both draw nearer until they were barely 20 feet apart, and finally close enough for me to confidently take a shot, only now my nerves were even more haywire. I simply couldn't steady my hands. I tried to regulate my breath and get a hold of myself, but then the forest started to terrorize me. Every single bird and bug seemed to be screaming. Even the squirrels were screaming. A wind blew into the blind from behind the deer, chilling me to the bone. The woods were creaking like mad, like something was going to come crashing down on top of me. I tried to ignore it all and looked back through the scope, deciding which one I should go for, thinking I might get both if I shot fast enough. I looked at the stag, then the doe, the back of the stag, and that's when I saw something I'll never forget. Standing between the deer was a dark figure. It was like a woman with no face, but I could feel her gaze. She was freakishly tall, but in the setting sunlight, I couldn't make out any details. It was like she was just a smudge on the lens of my scope. It's not real, I thought, and squeezed the trigger with my sight set on the stag, only for the rifle to jam. I instantly felt the forest collapsing on me. Both deer looked in my direction, and the figure behind them was coming towards me, bringing dusk and darkness with her. I panicked and ran out of the blind, abandoning everything. I was too scared to look back and see that thing chasing me, so I just ran. I don't know how close or how far that thing was from me, but I didn't stop until I got back to the fork in the road. My dad was already there, waiting for me, asking what the hell was happening. I tried to explain it to him, but he thought I had just wimped out of the kill, so he made me go back with him to retrieve the rifle. Unfortunately, I hadn't set up the marking ribbon, so we weren't able to find it before it got too dark. We had no choice but to go home. I refused to ever go hunting again, which was a major disappointment to my dad. He kept going back to try and find that blind again all season, but he was never able to get that rifle back, and he always blamed me for it. He just doesn't understand what I saw. There was something in that forest that didn't want me to kill those deer. I don't know what it would have done if the rifle hadn't jammed. I just hope my dad never runs into that thing.